Hello, tonight we're going to look back over the last 10 weeks at the ideas which have been raised in our series, The Modern World, 10 Great Writers. With me in the studio are Hermione Lee, Professor George Steiner, Professor Malcolm Bradbury, who acted as consultant on the series, and the writer Anthony Burgess. The Modern World, 10 Great Writers, could claim to be television's most sustained attempt to describe and analyse the literature of the past. We took the work of Dostoevsky, Ibsen, James Joyce, Conrad, T.S. Eliot, Proust, Pirandello, Thomas Mann, Virginia Woolf and Kafka. We picked them because of the force of their work at this generally acknowledged turning point in the history of thought, taste and art. We know there are omissions. That was inevitable. But the geographical span is wide and the work and ideas emerge from a variety of traditions. Our intention was to look at the work rather than the life of each writer, though we have combined a variety of techniques, including traditional documentary material and expert comment, such as those from three of our guests tonight. We chose to portray their writing through faithful dramatizations, chosen specifically to illustrate the author's ideas and always anchored to the notion the author himself expresses about it. But what exactly was or is the nature of the modern world of our title and the world of these 10 writers? Each writer invents his own individual world, but these 10 and other writers and artists of the period are linked together in what we call the modern movement. It's a movement that Malcolm Bradbury, for one, sees as a major modern revolution in literature, and it's this upheaval and its consequences that we're going to talk about tonight. Malcolm Bradbury, what's the nature of the upheaval?
Well, I do believe that, first of all, that there was a major modern movement. That is to say that somewhere, at a date that we might try to determine to some degree as we talk, in some fundamental way, the world of society, the world of politics, the world of ideas, and the world of art did change in ways so radical that writers in that period saw themselves as change makers or responders to the process of change. Certain writers felt this more than others. Certain writers were overwhelmed by the thought of modernity as such. Now, we might use the word modernism to describe this. It is not the word that those writers actually mostly use. If they called themselves members of something, they called themselves members of smaller movements, expressionism, imagism, futurism, or whatever it may be. But the word modernism is a late invention. You began by saying that these are the writers of the past, and so in some sense they are, but in another sense they are the writers of the present. And in fact that word modern I think is a very interesting and ambiguous word, because perhaps we aren't modern. It's possible that we are not modern, that we have somehow used the word modern in such a way during the course of the 20th century that we've spent it. We've spent its credibility, that somehow what we are is contemporary, or if we're sophisticates, we might say postmodern. In other words, that we have seen a great sense of change, a great sense of alteration in art forms, in intellectual ideas, in society, a concept of inner fragility, a concept of strange human exile, a concept of the dying of gods, a concept of loss of meaning in the world, of such a scale that certain writers seized on it, transformed experience for us, and they died and they've gone away from us, and we are after them. When we look back, when we think about them, if we are writers like Anthony Burgess, or if we are critics or scholars, or if we are general readers, somehow they are there solidly representing that transition, that strange crossover into a new condition. And I think the one thing, the most important thing perhaps to say about it is that when those writers wrote and asserted that they were modern, they constantly said that they were here to provide the new, make it new, said Ezra Pound. When they did that, they took a gamble. They didn't know that they were going to succeed. They were the anti-classics who somehow have become classics. They were the anti-traditionalists who have become a tradition. They were the people who were in revolt against modernity as well as the expressors of modernity. But we, in a program like this, or I think in our very way of building houses, looking at life, have put them in their place. We've made them our moderns.
Do you agree with Malcolm Bradbury, George Steiner, that the change was as radical a break with the past as he seems to imply?
What puzzles me is that in our list, which I think is a very fascinating and very rich one, there are a number of what now look like arch-conservatives, people who were rushing around the museum on the last closing afternoon. I'm thinking, of course, of Eliot, but also of Joyce's Ulysses and others, saying, look, I've got to inventory everything before closing time. This is the last time I can get it all in, mythology, history, religion, all past literature. I can think of no more profoundly conservative soul than Conrad. I mean, conservative in the deepest, in the most implacable sense. So first, there's a terrific problem, a paradox, that inside this modern movement, we have some of the great soldiers of the rear guard of a threatened Western inheritance.
Inside, the past is still trying to hold on.
And being held onto and given a last great shape, just like a museum catalogue, though infinitely rich. Pound's cantos would be another case. That's one of my problems. The other problem is I wonder whether, if there is such a program in the next millennium, God help us, they'll say, were these people great as they are, with one or two exceptions, Kafka and Dostoevsky spring to mind, why did they not see the main subjects of their whole age, the collapse into barbarism, the end of anything of a humanist hope in Europe, the coming of the night, the great coming of the night over this century? Are they at all adequate to what should be the writer's supreme task, which is to give imaginative warning and imaginative form to the inner change in the conditions of human political and social life? And that's one, I admit, that worries me a great deal. Are we being perhaps a little too favourable to what may have been a very curious blindness of vision?
Do you see that blindness of vision as being a marking quality?
I'd accept that to a great extent. I mean, as George, I think, has written in one of his books some time ago, Language and Silence, language has been incapable of expressing the nature of the Holocaust. The evil of our time has not found language. And in a sense, the writers we call modernists were terribly innocent. They hadn't yet seen, well, they were living at the time of the First World War, but they hadn't seen what could happen in Hitler's Germany. I would say that they were influenced by very innocent things. They were, first of all, much influenced by new notions of the nature of the mind. And, although Joyce rejected Freud, I think in Finnegan's Wake, my craft is ebbing, I am young and easily Freudened. He rejected Freud, but nevertheless, he did accept that the unconscious mind existed, that stream of consciousness existed and had to be presented. This meant breaking up the old form of the 19th century novel, which was too well made. Joyce's substitute for the well-made sentence, which had now turned into the stream of consciousness, was to impose a mythical structure, as he does in Ulysses. He shoves the Odyssey on top of the events of an ordinary day in Dublin. I would say that that's one aspect we have to consider, the discovery that the unconscious mind existed. The other is the nature of time. Time had become universalized. At the same time, time was being fractured, disorganized, broken up, and becoming highly subjective. We'd had Kant already telling us that time was one of the categories on which thought was built. Bergson came along, and of course Marcel Proust was much influenced by Bergson, saying that time was a subjective thing, la durée. At the same time, you could see through this new invention of the cinema that time could be reversed, time could be foreshortened. These are just two elements. In other words, these writers had to look both at one of the categories under which they were living, in the category of time, and possibly space too, because people were travelling faster. There was a new conception of space that went along with the conception of time. And at the same time, they were seeing that the human mind was not what Charles Dickens or Thackeray had thought it was.
Can I ask you to, Hermione Lee, to come, in this first round, address yourself to Malcolm Bradbury's opening statement about the hugeness and the radical nature of the upheaval.
Yes, I think that although it's absolutely true and very important and interesting to say that many of the great experimenters in style were also deeply reactionary in their politics, it's one of the phenomena, and that in many ways they didn't seem to be coming to terms with what was about to happen. Nevertheless, I think it would be absurd to say that they weren't, that these writers and many others who weren't on the programme weren't speaking for and representing some of the crucial things that were happening, were about to happen, such as exile, such as displacement. I think one of the most fundamentally interesting things about modernism is that it's an international movement, and I think it's the one time in the history, certainly of this island, that it hasn't, that it's broken through insularity, that you've had American influences and French, particularly French influences, and that you've had this kind of cross-culture, which has involved dislocation and fragmentation in the forms of the works as well as in the spiritual feelings of the work. The other thing that I think is very fundamental to the movement is, again, is a paradox, which is that if you ask people what emotion do you associate with the modernist writings? You might very well say angst or suffering or anxiety or guilt or loneliness or solitude. But those emotions, which I think are felt in all these writers, are counterpointed by an extraordinary ebullience and celebration and joyfulness. So I think that's a very strange thing that happens actually very much at that time.
Can I come back to something George Steiner said? There seems to be, perhaps there isn't, but it would seem to me that there's some agreement generally that these writers have informed our contemporary sensibility and perhaps in some ways imagined the world in which we live. And yet you were saying, if I heard you correctly, that on the whole you thought that they lacked the prophetic power, prophetic prerogative, which you said, which interested me, was the greatest thing a writer should give us. Now, first of all, do they? But secondly, is it the greatest thing that we should get from a writer?
I think Watchman, How Goeth the Night, is one, you're right, it's not the only, it is one of the great tasks. A writer should have antennae of human decency and human fear, somewhat more developed. And as I look around the portraits on this wall, Dostoevsky and Kafka, without any doubt, possibly Conrad in The Secret Agent and Under Western Eyes and Nostromo, which are prophetic political novels. But the extraordinary thing is that you would think there were, in 1915-16, let's go back into the heart of our program, 1915 and 16, the casualty lists during the great battles were 40, 50, 60,000 a day. The present estimate is at Verdun, 300,000 bodies lay unburied. History had known no such thing. Now, you would think that there would be a different order of thinking. And if we were to name a number of people who don't belong on this list, perhaps by their imaginative genius, such as George Orwell, but I could name others with that marvelous gift of saying, wait a minute, what is happening to human beings? And spelling it out. We have a touch of it at the end of The Magic Mountain. I thought that was beautifully brought out on this program. Just a touch. Curiously enough, Mann later, as you know, backtracked from his own illuminations. It was too terrifying to contemplate and becomes almost a reactionary classic. It is not the only function, but one of the things that perhaps they could have done a little more with is educate us to what was happening inside ourselves.
But do you have to spell it out? Do you have to spell it out in order to be writing about it? I mean, isn't Lawrence's Women in Love a great novel about the war and what is happening in Europe and what is happening to England without ever mentioning the war? I don't think that necessarily the war has to be the subject of the book in order for the book to write about what the effect of it is.
Lawrence's complete quest from 1916 onwards to find a completely new way would fit in exactly with what you were saying. You can say
can I point out how many of the books that were dealt with in this series were actually written across the war and changed by the experience of war? The Magic Mountain is the example you use. In fact, Mann, of course, began that as a short story about the relationship between art and decadence, and then it became the dialogue of a dying civilization. The sense of prophecy is extraordinarily powerful in the book. It's interesting, actually, that the first book that is dealt with chronologically, Crime and Punishment, actually ends with a massive prophecy of a world war. And that sense of the prophetic, that sense of something about to come, I think is extremely strong in quite a lot of the pre-war writing. But an awful lot of that writing actually is transfigured by the experience of its being written between 1914 and thereafter. The trial was started in August 1914.
Wasteland.
The Wasteland is...
Yes.
Ulysses was written across the First World War.
Yes, indeed. No, I think it's a good point that has been adumbrated, namely that when you come to think of the Georgian poets who were still functioning in England during the 1914-18 war, of whom Rupert Brooke was one, they were trying to write about this cataclysm and their own personal involvement in it in language and forms suitable only for, a weekend cottage. The work, the language, the possibilities generally of expressing what the First World War about were only realised fairly recently in the 1970s with a book by Thomas Pynchon called Gravity's Rainbow, where for the first time it was possible to use the whole breadth of language, with all its possible obscenities, serism, and what you will, to deal with that First World War. We waited a long time.
Well, I think that David Jones's In Parentheses dealt with it very well. For one thing. I also think there's another point, which is quite a useful one, I think relates to what George Steiner said. Graham Greene makes the point in one of his autobiographical pieces that when he was in a ward in a hospital where people were dying, when visitors came, they talked totally in cliches. And I feel that the Georgian poets, faced being in the war and seeing people, the cliche response, perhaps one's so numb that that is the only way to respond. I think that one can throw that in as part of the humanity versus modernism, which seems to be evolving as the part of this conversation.
Wilfred Owen did come out of that war. Indeed, he was killed, wasn't he, on Armistice Day? But
well, a whole generation of
he
English
did
poets.
Sassoon couldn't do it. Sassoon was still, a Georgian.
Can we bring this back, can we focus this once more on modernism? I mean, can we just be a little bit more specific again before we move on? When did it begin?
Let's can I have a try at this one? Because I was forced to have a try on it by having to write the book of the series. You, in constructing the series, take as the first book, chronologically, Crime and Punishment, which is 1864. Now, I came to find that very persuasive. Forced to reread Crime and Punishment, the book that I got much, much more out of on this particular reading. I found that date, the middle of the 1860s, with its extraordinary power of elements, that is to say, here is a writer who has suffered exile, has suffered near execution, who is already perceiving that it is possible to imagine a late romantic figure in a world where God is dead, or where he thinks that God is dead. Such a figure can then attempt to deal with his own experiences by declaring himself to be new. I am a new man. I am modern. And in this great act of modernity, the murder that he commits, the crime of modernity that he commits, he encounters what I think then peaks at the turn of the century, which is exactly that notion of modern existence as crisis, as crime, in a world which has been robbed of God, but which somehow needs a transcendental reassurance. So there's that modernity. And then the other one that the series goes for is the Ibsonian modernity, which is so positive and helpful. We're all going to be modern, we're going to be progressive, and we're going to be better. And women will revolt against the prison of marriage. And
men will lose guilt.
Men will lose guilt, and so on. So there are two moderns, really. There are two moderns that seem to me to start. But it does seem to me that the process, the key date, is somewhere at the end of the 19th century. And it's in the crises of the end of the 19th century.
Yes.
Can I go to George Steiner? Would you like to comment on that? Because
I think, the fun of this question is to be absolutely impudent. I think I know on what 2 afternoons the modern age began. 2. There's one when in a notebook, around 1874, probably spring, we aren't quite sure, the very obscure but absolutely decisive French poet, Stéphane Mallarmé, writes down that a word called rose has no smell, no thorns, no branch, it has no color, and it's because of that it can work in language. The tremendous, definitive, and to me horrifying insight that language does not refer outside itself, which I think is the beginning of the whole crisis. From then on there's no looking back. No. After that, what forgiveness? And Hermione will please tell me what afternoon it was when straight she is sitting in a London drawing room. Vanessa, Virginia's sister, enters and his finger goes out. There's a spot on her dress, her summer frock, and he says, seamen. That had not been possible in literate company, in possible exchange. That afternoon, also, there's no turning back. I think in some ways that is a much bigger revolution than Freud's, which is a very pedantic, immensely conservative and academic one. Once you can say, in mixed company, seamen at a spot on a girl's dress, then our sense of eros and our sense of the experimental relation of language to sex, which surely is key to being modern, is underway. So I'd name those 2 afternoons.
It's also quite important that it's a homosexual saying the word
That's
as
a very
well,
feminine remark.
I think it's useful to say that modernism, say in this country, let's take this country, began in 1912 and ended in 1939 with the publication of Joyce's Finnegan's Wake, which I think is probably an example of modernism going as far as it decently can. But having said that, then you start making exceptions. I mean, you go back to Baudelaire, who may be behind it all. I mean, when Eliot was influenced by Lafargue, he was really being influenced by Baudelaire and possibly by Mallarmé. I accept what George says to some extent, that language is being separated from things. Language is becoming non-referential. But I don't think that can go quite... I mean, the rose is still... still refers to a rose.
Not for Mallarmé.
Not well, to some extent it did. It couldn't help because the word was already there in the marketplace. This is one of the problems: trying to cope with the marketplace meaning of a word and the more refined meaning that a poet gives to it. This was Mallarmé's great problem. Great modernist, although he was he wrote L'Après-midi d'un Fontaine. Debussy set it in 1895. There's the beginning of modern music, I think, with that. Why did that happen? Because in 1889, 100 years next year, you had the great Exposition in Paris to celebrate the revolution. He heard Javanese music for the first time, music change, etc., etc.
It's very interesting.
When I say 1912, you see, which incidentally in music is the year of Pierre au Lunaire by Schoenberg, not heard in England at that time. When I say that, that's only to give me the opportunity to say it happened earlier. But one can't be sure of the actual date. 1904, great Russian novel. I think Vladimir Nabokov said.
Biely, St. Petersburg.
Yes, Petersburg by Bailey. Which has all the Joycean tricks, which is self-referential.
But Mallarmé prints with large blanks. Actually begins the whole modern obsession with silences and blanks and saying we can't do it anymore. If we think we can speak it, it's already wrong. And I think that's pretty fatal.
It's interesting
just
the way
a second,
that...
Hermione's been waiting to get it.
Well, I was just thinking about this business about exhibitions and the way in which writers are constantly not just influenced by music, obviously, but by painting. And Virginia Woolf date for the beginning of, she says, in or around December 1910, human character changed. Not the world, but human character. What she's actually referring to is the post-impressionist exhibition in London, for which Roger Fry wrote a very influential catalogue. And I think that attempt to try and pinpoint it is part of the process of modernism. Everybody wants to know, when is it? Is it now? Can we date it? And the further away you move from it, the more ambiguous the parameters seem. I mean, I think the other interesting question is, when did it end? And one of the things that happened to modernism in the 30s was that all the great modernist movements in Europe, such as Expressionism, were crushed, were put down, so that modernism becomes the victim of what it, in a sense, you're saying, ought to have been prophesying. I think that is the end point is as crucial as the beginning.
And if we're talking about human nature changing and the relationship between external changes that affect human nature, which you began in your statement, and the way in which art or literature or the way we lead our life responds, surely in the last 100 years, the two greatest changes, what could I have been, things that have arrested us most have been the Holocaust and Hiroshima. And these are after even your late date of 1939. So this relationship begins to sort of swing out of kilter when you follow it through, doesn't it?
But you see, I think there's a very important reason for this. I must let George come back on this absolutely crucial question for him, but I think there is a very important reason. I'd like to test your statement a little bit further with George. That is that once the Holocaust and the atomic bomb had occurred, then modernism, in a sense, was discredited as well as confirmed. A simultaneous process went on at the same time. That is to say, that anxiety about silence that George was talking of, the crisis of the word, was in one way confirmed. Words no longer could deal.
No, well, that's the point that George has always made.
Exactly.
I don't know whether it's changed, but I remember the book very well, Language and Silence.
That's right.
George, I remember George when we were together in New York, speaking most eloquently on the need for silence. But he was right. Literature, indeed language, possibly cannot deal with these things. Language has limitations. Well, I don't think language is capable of dealing with a sexual orgasm.
But isn't that the influence of, in a way, that's one of the influences of modernism? That I mean, if you compare late Beckett with Joyce, his master, he's gone from the utmost use of words to the utmost use of silence.
Malcolm addressed. Did you finish your?
Yes. Well, I was simply going to suggest that modernism is that movement which leads up to the moment we are describing. And postmodernism, or something else, some other conception, is needed for the period thereafter. In other words, I'm attempting to confirm in some fashion the notion of a second fracture, the second magic date, that Anthony introduced in 1939. I would perhaps put in 1945, you see.
But I'm sure you've noticed that within our great list, one of the curious things is how many things they don't manage to finish. Kafka, nothing. Musil can't finish that very great novel, The Man Without Qualities. Hermann Broch, whose Death of Virgil is one of the real frontier works, his other great novel on totalitarianism, 5 endings, none of them agreed upon. The sense of the fragmentary begins coming into some of our people, and this too, I think, is extremely suggestive. that the great sense, opus 1, 2, 3, and I've done it in Perfectus Est, is beginning to be very embarrassing. We don't have what was to be the great next volume of the Brothers Karamazov, which was to be the upbeat volume, waited for by everybody. As we look around this whole thing, Proust does not finish. What we have today is one of the states of the great drafts of the last part of the novel. No period before. Our period is absolutely full of tremendous design, structures of a vast architectural kind, and then the facade doesn't quite work. And I think that, too, may define it. Since then, we've gotten very tight, very minimalist.
Joyce managed to finish his works. I mean, Ulysses is undoubtedly finished. Finnegan's Wake goes back on itself, but it's still finished. I'd agree on the whole with that, but wasn't it Paul Valéry who said poems are not finished, they're abandoned? Yeah. I think it's probably true of novels as well. As a practicing novelist, and probably you, George, who are, by way of being occasionally a novelist, and Malcolm, who is a novelist too, we find that the difficulty is always finishing. That we've reached a stage now in which we do not know what we're really talking about. We don't know what our words mean. We hope to God that some meaning will emerge by the time we finish, but it very rarely happens. This is an aspect, I think, not of postmodernism, but modernism.
That breakdown of the idea of the opus, which is so interesting and crucial, also goes with another very odd paradox, which is the need to name things, the way in which modernism is full of manifestos and programmes, and a few don'ts and a few do's and so on. Everybody is always, in the modernist movement, is saying what they are doing and what kind of thing it is, and yet the thing becomes harder and harder to categorise. So the very word novel, with all those new, modern implications, becomes a word that less and less usable. So when Virginia Woolf ends up in her diaries saying she wants her last book not to be a novel, but an elegy, and she doesn't know what to call it.
It's best to die, I think, in the middle of a great work, or towards the end of a great work. Then you can't be blamed.
Or you have Lawrence's very bad luck, and you're dying slowly while you're writing some of your greatest work. And that maybe is what gives him this sort of prophetic resonance, which is greater than almost any of these we've dealt with.
If we had a well-disposed visitor from Mars, a gentle, patient one, scratching his head as he looks around us and at our discussion, he'd say, look, the things that strike an outsider as enormous changes. What are they? They are women, the emergence of women in Western culture in an entirely new way. They are the fact that we discover the child as never before in law, society, feeling. Suddenly, this is the child's millennium. And thirdly, I would say ecology, the sense of horror and alarm about the garbage dump we're making of our planet. The astonishing thing is, we do not have a great novel about children. The last one is The Pack in the Brothers Karamazov, and Cocteau's bizarre Les Enfants, very bizarre, marginal. We have Virginia Woolf, and Hermione's going to get very angry, but this might be a token presence. There should by now be a giant, a woman giant, and she would not be for me Virginia Woolf at all. And the curious thing is it's Pynchon, in part. It is some of the latest American experimentalists for whom the destruction of the planet is becoming the big theme. Ought they not to have spotted some of that?
Well, that's a good point at which to end the first half of this discussion. We'll be back in a moment or two. Welcome back, as I say, and one of the things that's been emerging in this discussion on modernism based on the 10 Great Writers series has been a growing divergence between what's been happening in the external world and the way in which that's been reflected in the writers, many of whom we have long thought of as being those who imagined the contemporary world. That is to say, did they get enough in? Did they talk about the real world in a substantial way which mattered to those who were living in it? Before the break, George Steiner challenged Hermione Lee about several omissions in the great writers' canon and catalogue almost, including the fact that modernism had not yet thrown up a great woman writer.
Yes, well, I'm glad you raised that. You wouldn't guess it from this series. Perhaps you wouldn't even guess it from the personnel around this table. But I think there have been some great women modernist writers. I think that the attitude to modernism and the promotion of modernism has been peculiarly and distinctively male-dominated. There's a wonderful letter from Pound in 1928 to Zhukovsky, planning a poetry reading, saying to him, not too many women, and if possible, no wives. If some insist on accompanying their mariti, make sure they are bored. And I think that that denigration, that down-putting, has actually been a feature of the movement, partly because I think modernism, in some cases, particularly Pound and Wyndham Lewis, is presented as a sort of energetic, virile activity. Women aren't supposed to say blast, partly because modernism has been a movement of exile, and to go into exile, to leave your country, to set up another life, to shock the bourgeoisie was something that was extremely difficult for women to do in the 1910s and 20s. You had to have an independent income, you had to lead an independent life, and many of the women actually in Paris who were part of the modernist movement were lesbians, and that's another way of being silenced by history. Having said all that, as sort of perhaps sounding like special pleading, I think that the names that have noticeably not appeared in the discussion or in the series have been the names of Gertrude Stein, who not only is the great panjandrum of modernism in Paris, sort of great magus figure, but also a genuinely original experimental writer. And I think that Tender Buttons and Three Lives is every bit as readable as Finnegan's Wake or the Cantos. Dorothy Richardson, whose great 12-volume epic roman fleuve Pilgrimage languishes unread. And I think the trouble is that if women write short-length, intense lyrics, then they're dismissed as being slight, and if they write epics, they're dismissed as being boring.
I would accept that, although I think Dorothy Richardson's Pilgrimage is probably a great book. I'm scared of saying that because nobody would agree with, not even women as well.
It is a great book. It's a tremendous book.
I think it probably is. Whether it owes anything to Joyce, I don't really know.
Can we bring the conversation now into the relationship between the novel and modernism, more specifically? Why do you think that the novel was such a conveyor and benefactor of from modernism? Malcolm, would you like to briefly set us off on that?
It seems to me that modernism is as powerful in any of the genres, any one of the genres, that is to say, in poetry, in drama, and in fiction. And the fact that we have emphasised the novel in this series is not a reflection of a total situation. However, there is little doubt, I think, that, as Hermione was saying, the idea of the novel being over and the need for a new book to be invented, a new prose book to be invented, is very strong in this entire movement, if we can call it a movement. And that one of the reasons for this, it seems to me, is that the novel, as it had developed in the 19th century, is a great Whig book. It's a great book of progressive history. It's a story of a bourgeois society. It's the Burger epic. It's a story of things taken in order and moving progressively forward. And the sense of history being shocked, shaken, upset, the sense that an individual does not simply see the world realistically and engage easily with society and lock in neatly to society, the sense that there is a world behind the self, that there is a world under the self, an unconscious world, that there is a secret world, that even the bearer of those secrets does not fully understand. All of these things have to be incorporated into a form which is powerful, extended, but which has been doing quite other things up to this point. And suddenly the great prose book, which is a post-novel or an after-novel, later than the novel, becomes a very important kind of book to produce. Could I just add one thing about women here, because we perhaps cut that one off a little bit fast. I think it's very interesting that Gertrude Stein, who I think is a very great writer, actually tried to write a great modernist novel, The Making of Americans, and in my view, failed. Now, it's very interesting that she failed, and I think she failed because she didn't actually believe in the novel. I just appear to have said that nobody should believe in the novel. I think what is interesting is that many of the people who succeeded in writing the great modernist anti-novel actually did believe in the novel. They believed in epic power. They believed in sweep. That Joyce is a great novelist writing the anti-novel. Gertrude Stein is not a great novelist.
She's a great portraitist.
Absolutely. She's wonderful at short length.
Can I just have one second then? If because it's come back to something that was raised by George Steiner, it has become a theme. If the novel was so available and those practicing novel writing were so radical, self-conscious and intelligent in their response to this change in modernism, why does it keep missing out the things that you, the great facts of humanity, as it were, that you say kept missing out?
Let me make a guess. If we were talking with painters, they would say, look, black on black, or pile of bricks on floor, or canvas bag on nail is something new, and let's not bluff. That is a quantum jump. if you're talking to musicians, and Anthony will come in on this, they might or might not say that the 12-tone system, that atonality, which is... They would say that aleatory music, electronic music, quantum jump. We've never had anything. Once you're in language, you're in trouble. You carry the whole past right on your back. So what are you going to do? Once you use a narrative and tell a story, however radical, Kafka, however surrealist, it's already enlisted an enormous amount of classical tradition. Terribly difficult. Dos Passos pastes newspaper stories in, he tries. There have been many attempts to say, look, this is like no other language, but the moment they tell us that, it's in language. So I think they've had a hell of a problem. What I would like to say is that it's often the poem that has done it, and I'd like to jump on your side and get out of all insularity. I would take it that probably Stalinism, which is the other gigantic thing of our time, for God's sakes, there's been a Russian Revolution, which is a lot more important than almost anything else we've talked about. It is a woman who can do it, who can do the inside and the outside. It's Akhmatova, one of the supreme poets of all time, who can sit there and say, I will tell you what it feels like to be. So that in that sense, poetry had an easier job, maybe, being nearer to music and painting, making the quantum jump. A novel is inherently a very archaic form.
What's your response?
Well, it doesn't change, yes, but whatever you call it, there has to be some art form which is really basically a narrative structure with people in it. We still judge novels by the reality of the people. I mean, people say, for example, I'm sorry to keep bringing up Joyce, but they say that Finnegan's Wake is a chaos, or the Joyceans themselves say it goes beyond the novel, but it's a novel in the sense that there's a hero and heroine and children and things happen. And you can't get away from this form, whatever you call it. What I was going to say was that the novel itself changed and became something not quite like the novels of Dickens and Thackeray, or earlier Sir Walter Scott, because of, was it Tony Tanner who said that there was a change which can be summed up under the double rubric of the death of God and the death of the omniscient narrator. This is a bit simplistic, but if you say that God no longer exists, as Nietzsche said, I suppose Nietzsche must be one of the modernists, then you can no longer write a novel in which the narration is in the hands of somebody who knows everything, because you can't be God. It is not a question of blasphemy, it's a question of lack of reality. So that with the novels of, say, Conrad, and I would say very definitely Ford Madox Ford, a very important writer indeed, totally neglected in this country, not in America, but here. There you have this new attempt to put narration in the hands of an unreliable narrator, a number of narrators, as in Joyce, and present the old material of the novel, namely human life, in a new form. That is not quite a quantum jump, but it's something that had to happen.
It'd be interesting to say something about words. Conrad, in the preface to The Enigma of the Narcissus, says that all he has to use is the old words, worn thin, defaced by ages of usage. And one of the ways, attempts to get around that, as you said, with John Dos Passos, is using contemporary, new kinds of language, such as street speech and advertising and commercial language. And I think one of the fascinating things about modernism that in a way we haven't talked about yet is this conjunction between vox populi, some kind of street speech, and the extraordinary elitism of a lot of the writers, which is going back to your point about their conservatism and their authoritarianism. This seems to me something that's an extraordinary paradox.
Do you think that these modernist writers and the way that the modernists wrote actually changed fundamentally the way that the common reader, sorry to reintroduce that word, the common reader reads? Do you think it had that much impact?
Well, can I just point out a very interesting paradox here? When Joyce's Ulysses appeared in Paris in 1922, it was a banned book in Britain. It was a hidden book. It's what I call an underwear book. That is to say, the way you got it into Britain was by hiding it in your underwear.
That's what I did.
And, yes, exactly. So here is a book that stands on the margins in almost every possible sense. It is published in exile, out of exile, by printers who printed it not in their own language, and it is moved slowly towards the centre. That process of its moving towards the centre partly depends on somebody like a major interpreter, Anthony Burgess. Indeed should be said to be such an interpreter. But that book is now a sixth form classic. You see. It's moved from that very, very marginal position into monumentalism. Now, have we destroyed it by doing that? What have we done to it by doing that?
Yes,
I
think it's a very good
George
point, because one of the advantages of old age is that one reads certain books earlier than other people. And I read Ulysses, which I did, in fact, bring back from Paris, cut up and distributed between my two socks, walking bandy-legged. But I got through the customs with it. And it is impossible now for me to recapitulate the particular feeling I had there. This was modernism. This was something. Things were being broken down in a big way. I mean, I don't mean only the obscenity, but the pattern of speech, the pattern of thought. In turning it into, as you say, a monument, the modernism, that quality of newness.
Has it sort of delivered its message, and are you saying that the messenger may no longer be as important?
I think this
George
involves
Steiner.
what you brought out right at the beginning, time, which we haven't talked about. The attention span is diminishing fantastically towards print. The amount of time we can afford for print, the amount of memorization, concentration. Now, you have Webern, a musician where you have some terribly exciting pieces of less than a minute or a minute and a half. Abstract art, collage, montage, film techniques can work with this new sense of time. One is struck that much that is most modern in modernism, really exciting, is trying to cope with this. A Borges parable, which is a few lines long. A Kafka fiction less than a page, some of the greatest, some of the most inexhaustible. It may be that the attention span demanded by narrative, by traditional narrative, the hours of silence, or pseudo-silence with the TV on and the radio, the kind of privacy which a novel demands, that is what is less and less available. And I think the novel has been trying to struggle for the diminishing amount of human capacities for silence and concentration. And this, we are in a different time
But
scale.
is that germane to what the modernists, modern writers thought they were about?
No, I think they still hoped for the old reader.
Yeah.
One of the
But
curious
yes.
things is their sense of someone with... And Joyce must somewhere have thought that you had 600 dictionaries and 1,000 hours.
But George Sanders, Malcolm Bradbury's description of the history of Ulysses proves that there are more and more people prepared to devote a lot of time to reading 600 pages of Ulysses.
It does not prove
more
that.
and more and more. as the
They are
century
being
goes on.
taught it in school.
Not only being taught it, they're
I'm
buying
not
it in
at all
shops as well.
convinced of the evidence that the monumental is widely read.
But didn't-
I think
This is
it
the nature of
skimmed.
monuments.
It
What do
is
we do with
skimmed.
monuments?
But didn't the modernist writers themselves, most of them, think that there was going to be a different or a small audience? I mean, wasn't one of the fears out of which they were writing was a sense of what D.H. Lawrence called the hordes? He said, drown all the hordes, let them all drown. The readership was not going to be amongst the hordes. That the idea of a common reader is a terribly hard to come by idea, and if the things have become monuments, it may be because you seem almost to be suggesting they've been cloistered in the academy, and that might be a bad thing. That surely is the way in which they've been preserved.
They're also being presented on television, and that is what we're about here and now. But the interesting thing, George used the word antenna or antennae at the beginning of this conversation, and it reminds me of the famous phrase of Pounds about the nature of making it new, where he says, artists are the antennae of the race, but the bullet-headed many will never trust their great artists. However, he assumes that the nature of the avant-garde gamble is that one day they will. Now, there are several interesting ironies there. One is that the bullet-headed many, in Pound's case, sort of turned out to be right. They shouldn't have trusted Pound, because look what Pound did. He became part of the Mussolini camp. He broadcast those treasonable broadcasts during the war, and at the end of his life, he had to recount a good deal of the work that he had achieved. But on the other hand, the assumed gamble was one day our prophecy, and you talked about the writer's prophet, one day our prophecy will prove true. It will fulfill itself. Now, the danger, or the trouble with the avant-garde gamble, is that at that moment, when the prophecy proves true, you cease to be new.
Yes.
You become old. You are suddenly part of the tradition that you have up to this point.
And maybe you have to rely on the things that you yourself repudiated, i.e. your narrative power, your power to draw characters is more important than your experimental energy. As we're coming towards the end of this television hour, do you think modernism is sustaining itself now, starting with you, George Steiner? Is modernism sustained as a complex of notions, and if so, where?
Probably in music, it is still, I mean, Boulez in after is an extraordinarily powerful development of earlier positions. Art, as you know, is swinging back to a very worrying kind of realism, neorealism, and even kitsch realism. In literature, I think our conversation, and this is not meant in any way as an objection, it's meant to keep things on the table. We've been talking as if America wasn't, and this isn't on. Your question is crippled by the fact that we haven't.
It's been available. There was no bar put on this job.
But I would like to know...
America is always available, particularly in conversation on English television.
But the succession to Faulkner's Sound and Fury, Absalom, Absalom, the succession to Lolita, Lolita above all, perhaps a great novel, greatest novel of the century, with Dr. Zhivago, perhaps, I'm saying, at least are these two Russian novels out of Russia, inside, outside. Now, we'd have to think, I think in America there is a very real sign that we're still in a stage of argued modernism at many levels. Quite frankly, I think in Europe, I may be totally wrong on this, it's hard to make out.
I think America, if I may say this, it's a dangerous thing to say, has always been anti-modernist. I mean, it begins with William Carlos Williams, you know, who insists against Eliot on the homegrown product and so forth. And looking at, all right, mention Nabokov. Nabokov was a Russian exile, not really a modernist, or using the tag ends of modernism. There's never been a modernist movement in America. Possibly the whole commercial system of book production is against it, but I think it's essentially a European phenomenon. I think I'd stand or fall on that. It's something that happened in Europe, something that happened belatedly in this island, or in these islands, but it never really reached beyond Europe.
You have to say, Anthony, that Carlos Williams' objection to Eliot was that he was reactionary, that he was
not modernist
traditionalist,
enough.
that he was not modernist enough.
Yes, but modernism meant something quite different.
different.
Modernism meant Americanism, you see.
Yes.
Quite different.
See, I totally disagree with what Anthony said. I mean, I do think that modernism started in Europe. I think that is true.
I think it ended in Europe, too.
I think it was totally appropriated by Americans, that nearly all the major entrepreneurs of modernism were American, including Eliot.
No, John Quinn and people like that.
Yes, including many of the English ones.
They bought the manuscript.
Many of the people who started in Europe found themselves, for one reason or another, exiled to the United States. That it was in the United States that that famous transaction, somebody pointed out that one of the key transactions of modernism is from the painter Picasso to apartment houses that are called the Picasso, you see. And that great change, that is to say the great assimilation of modernism, particularly seems to me to happen in the United States. I would argue that if it had not been for the Americans, modernism would simply be a hole-and-corner affair and would have remained an elite secret, and that we would still be spending all our time reading Arnold Bennett, John Galsworthy, and a number of H.G. Wells,
Ian Foster.
Yes, Ian
Good
Foster.
writers in there.
Exactly.
Some very good writers.
And maybe we should.
Ian Foster is not utterly provincial, George. No. But are you saying anything other than America marketed modernism?
I'm also saying that the reason that America assimilated modernism is that America actually believed that it was a culture of the modern. And that, and I think that the acceptance of modernism has a great deal to do with the realization that we ourselves, as human beings, as individuals, live in a modern world.
I'm not forgetting, Malcolm, that the two great modernists working in Paris, incidentally, were American. I mean, Gertrude Stein and Ernest Hemingway, who we've not mentioned. I mean, Ernest Hemingway was the man who was able to put into readable practice what Gertrude Stein promulgated experimentally. I don't think there's any doubt about that.
I just wanted to say something which is perhaps slightly off this tangent, but which is to do with your question about what legacy is, what it's left us with. Because it seems to me that these books, in a way, have become classics and monuments, and there's nothing we can do about that. That is time, and we are the victims of chronological time, although they try to break it down.
A lot of people around this table have helped to make them more
yes, indeed. And but they are also shocking, and I think that you find that if you teach these books, or if you try to talk about these books in a classroom, everybody's got to read The Wasteland for the first time. Everybody's got to try and read Ulysses for the first time, or read To the Lighthouse for the first time. And some of these books are still very shocking and startling and difficult in all sorts of energising ways. And indeed, I think that many of the modernist books would not escape whipping under Clause 29. I mean, À la Recherche and Women in Love might yet be banned books again in this country. And I think that they still do have that kind of energy for our time.
Yes, I agree.
So in that sense, you don't think that they've run out of relevance?
I'd say that there are a lot of them we have to rediscover. I dream of a program on which we could discuss taboo books. I have in mind those whose politics are so nauseating, yet which are great works of genius. Céline's Voyage to the End of the Night is probably the most experimental, also unbearable. There's a whole list still of underground. You spoke of smuggling in. Much of greatness of Russian literature is it has to be smuggled across a frontier. To my sense, a book is eternally modern when censorship hunts it down.
I think that's a resounding sentence on which to end this conversation. Thank you to Hermione Lee, George Steiner, Anthony Burgess, Malcolm Bradbury. Good night.